We are glad that you are here tonight. We will be in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 tonight. Is it working? Boom. She's going to fix it right now.
What's your favorite candy?
I kind of like Kit Kats, man. They're kind of good. Don't look at me like that.
Alright, I like dots of fruit snacks.
You like what?
Dots of fruit
It's
snacks.
working. You'll have to do it. Thank you. All right. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is where we're at tonight. Good to see all of you. We've got, Paul has been teaching for the last several chapters. He started in chapter 1, covered it in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. He finally finished this long section on groups, cliques, divisions in the church. And told the Corinthians, hey, knock it off. No divisions in the church, and gave them a lot of good reasons why they shouldn't be taking sides and choosing different people over anybody else. The church is wide open. You've got all the teachers. You don't have to pick one favorite. And so that's what he's been talking about. Tonight, we switch gears. He's still talking about problems. However, as we're going to find out here very quickly, in fact, in verse 1, we're going to find out that there were a couple of other problems in the church. There were many more problems, but these are the next two that we get to. So, couple of main divisions. We are seeing sexual immorality. Awkward. Inside the church, and then outside the church. And let's see what that looks like. Our first division inside the church, we're going to see that there are a couple of different problems. Let's get into the first one in verse 1. There are some sinful situations, the first of which is the sexual immorality. Verse 1. It is actually reported, Paul says, that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. So there was sexual immorality, sexual sin happening inside the church. And the type, we're told by Paul here, was that a man was with his father's wife. So most likely that was his stepmom. Okay? Now, we have no idea. Where was the dad at? Were they divorced? Did the dad die? We have no idea. But they're in this really weird relationship where it's the stepmom and the stepson have now hooked up. Whoa. So that is the first problem. That is the first problem. Okay? Now, you and I need to understand that the church, and not just talking about the Corinthians now, but I'm talking about every Christian church, and I'm talking about revival also. There are always going to be issues and problems in the church. There always will be. We've got a large church here with a lot of people. And whenever you have people, any number of people, you are going to have issues, you're going to have problems. Everybody knows that. You may have a great family, a sweet family. But it may be that there are times when, maybe it's not arguing or at each other all the time, but there are probably times, no doubt, when there are at least disagreements. When there's some kind of attitude, you wake up just feeling a certain way, and that comes out, as soon as you start talking to people. So there are always going to be issues, okay? So the fact that there is sexual immorality happening in the Corinthian church is not surprising. It's not surprising. It's not good, but it's not surprising. We have issues. We have problems. We're going to look at this. We won't move on any further from this. Leanna's helping me out tonight. We won't move on any further from this yet. But let me just say that this was the first of two problems. Because the second problem comes when they look at how it's being handled. So there's sin in the church, but how it's being handled, there was a problem there. But let's look at verse 1 again real quickly, just so we have some understanding. It is actually reported, Paul says, that there is sexual immorality. That word there, there's one original word for those two words, and the word is porneia. Porneia. We are somewhat familiar with the first part of that because it sure sounds a lot like pornography, and that's because that's exactly what it is. That's what the word is used for. Porneia refers to any sex outside of a husband and wife relationship. So there's no need to go into detail about types or kinds or what about this and what about that. You and I just need to know that what Paul is talking about is he's talking about any kind of sex outside of a husband and wife relationship. Okay? So that covers it all. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. And then he goes on to tell us that it's this incestual, even though they're stepmom, stepson, it still would be considered to be incestual. It's no good. Okay? Now, that's the first of the two sinful situations. The first one was the sexual immorality. Okay? Not good, not surprising, but not good. But the thing is, okay, there's problems. There's always going to be problems. There will be problems in the high school group. Many of you know that. Sometimes there's going to be drama, or there's going to be issues, or I heard this, or she did that, or she said that, or he said this thing, or he did this thing, or whatever. There are always going to be issues, but then the problem then comes, or the challenge then comes in how we handle those situations, those issues. Now, in the case of the Corinthians, look what they did in verse 2. Paul says, he just described the type of problem, and then he says, and you are puffed up. That means that they were prideful about what was happening in their church. If you jump down real quickly to verse 6, he says again, your glorying is not good. So evidently, from those couple of verses, we can gather at least a little bit of an idea of what the church or how the church was handling it. They find out that there's sexual immorality in the church. That's a problem. That's an issue. Not surprising. Not good, but not surprising. But how are we going to deal with it? Well, for the Corinthians, they actually celebrated. They were celebrating the fact that it was taking place in their church. And they were not only okay with it, not only overlooking it, but he says that they were puffed up, they were prideful about it, and then down in verse 6, that they were, that they were glorying. They were glorying in it. So evidently, they were actually proud that this type of thing was happening in their church. Now, why in the world would a church be proud or be celebrating this type of a relationship or celebrating sin in their church? Well, that's a good question. We're not there. However, we can surmise, we can understand that this church in Corinth. Now, if you were here for the very first study, our intro, where we covered the first 2 verses of the entire book, we talked about the type of city that Corinth was. Remember that? Remember that it was on an isthmus, a little tiny piece of land, and there were sailors constantly coming across the land traveling. There were people coming traveling north and south. Remember that there was a temple in Corinth with 1,000 priestesses, they called them, but they were actually prostitutes. And every single night, those 1,000 prostitutes would come down into the city and sell themselves in order to make money to take it back to their temple. It was part of their worship. So that gives you and I an idea on what kind of a city it was, what kind of environment it was. The sexual relationships were out in the open. It was just a thing that they did. Now, it doesn't sound too far from the type of a society that we're living in. Now, we don't have a temple in town where there's 1,000 priestesses coming down, but we know that type of activity takes place all the time. We know that. We know that those of us that are on social media, you know that you can open up your social media and there's always some sort of, at the very least, sexually suggestive posts, or you're seeing something there on your feed. You don't have to go very far into your popular page maybe to start looking at, what else is going on out there to see things. See people with, very little clothing on, or, in whatever, however they're posing, or the types of situations that they have themselves in. So even for us, we've got some sort of idea that, man, it was being pumped into the minds of the Corinthians constantly. And we learned early in the book that the Corinthians were struggling with philosophy and, what the popular philosophies were of the day. So the Corinthians were having a really, really hard time living in the type of society that Corinth was giving them. It was pressure from everywhere. It was freedom from everywhere. It's out in the open. So the question is, why are you guys being so, all tight and grouchy about it? Like, everybody does it. What's the big deal? What's the problem? And so the church was struggling to make their stand. In fact, they weren't making their stand. They weren't standing for righteousness. They were giving in. And so that becomes the second problem. The first problem being one of sexual immorality, but then the second problem, which made it even worse, was that the church was not handling it correctly. Verse 2, he says, you are puffed up, and you have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. So we get a little hint there in verse 2 as to the solution, which is what we're going to see in just a moment. So the sinful situations, there were two of them. The sexual immorality, and then the fact that it was celebrated. Okay? But then we move on to the solution. So what do we do about it? What did Paul say to do about it? Well, what were the Corinthians supposed to do about it? What should you and I do about it? Verse 3, Paul says, for I indeed, as absent in body. So Paul wasn't there in Corinth. He's writing from Ephesus. Sent this letter. For I indeed, as absent in body, but present in spirit. Now that does not mean that there was some kind of like, he was a Jedi and he sent, he did like that Luke thing and sent his a vision of himself to Corinth or something. And, that's not what he's talking about. He's just saying, look, it's you need to handle it as if I'm there. I'm with you is what he's saying. I'm there for you. For indeed, as absent in body but present in spirit, he's talking about himself, have already judged, as though I were present, him who has so done this deed. Now, this is a strange thing for you and I, because we all learned from Tupac that only God can judge me, right? And we all the time, man, we hear people say, well, you can't judge me. Don't judge me. Don't judge. And yet Paul says here in verse 3, he expressly says, I have already judged him who has so done this deed. So Paul had already judged him. And that is because Paul was judging rightly. He was judging correctly. And he says in verse 4, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you are gathered together, along with my spirit, he says, with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to see that what he's about to tell the Corinthians is going to be a very difficult thing for them to do. And so he preps that by saying, listen, I'm with you, Corinthians, I'm with you. He says, but also in verse 4, you have the power of our Lord Jesus Christ with you also. Do you see what he's doing? He's gearing them up. He's getting them ready because he's about to tell them to do something very, very difficult. Here's the solution in verses 5 through 8. We see that it is separation. Verse 5. Deliver such a one. Now he's talking about evidently the guy in that relationship that was in the relationship with his stepmom. Okay? Evidently that guy was the one that was part of the church. It doesn't seem to refer to the lady at all. I don't know if she was there or she wasn't there. But evidently the guy was the one that was the source of the problem. And Paul's solution is in verse 5, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Paul's solution is, he says something, this is drastic. He says that person needs to be delivered to Satan. And it's like, what? Now, some of us may be thinking, but wait a minute. I thought the church was supposed to be loving, accepting, forgiving, merciful, kind. Why would we want to deliver anybody to Satan? And you see, that's what the Corinthians were struggling with. Wanting to be the cool church or the hip church or the loving church. And so they found themselves in the situation where they were okay with this sin and not judging the sin like they should have been. So Paul's giving them instructions. This is what you need to do. And he says this. He says, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that, hey, give this guy, put him in handcuffs, deliver him to the pastor, and tell the pastor to go pay Satan a visit and drop this guy off? Like you bang on the door, you throw the guy on the porch, and you run away. Is that what you're supposed to do? This is a figure of speech. When he says deliver this person to Satan, he doesn't mean that you physically take this guy and you go find Satan wherever he is, and you go give this guy to Satan. What he's saying, and it'll become a little clearer as we move through the next few verses, what he is saying is this. He's saying that you need to separate this person from your church. In other words, you need to kick this guy out. Seems harsh. Seems harsh. Spoiler alert. In the next epistle, in 2 Corinthians, Paul will fix this problem again. He'll say, hey, the guy repented. He turned away from his sin. Now you got to let him back in because afterwards they actually did what Paul was telling them to do. And then when the guy turned away from his sin and wanted to come back, they said, no, get out of here. You got cooties or whatever, It's like, no, you can't come back in. And so Paul then had to correct them again and say, no, let the guy back in. He turned away from that sin. But in this case, he's telling them, look, you need to get this guy out of your church. You cannot allow him to stay in the church. Now, why is that? It is for, verse 5, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Yes. In other words, you get rid of him from the church. You no longer cover him. And now he's open to the abuse of the world, basically. And in verse 5, the goal of that is that his spirit may be saved. It's a saved soul, but a wasted life. It's you put him out there with the world. If he wants to live like the world, then you deliver him over to the world and let the world do what they're going to do to that guy. But Paul's goal in verse 5 was that his spirit would be saved. So you want this guy to be saved? You want him to be corrected? You got to move him out of the church. This is what is commonly called it's commonly called church discipline. I don't know if you knew what that is. You were like, well, I thought that was just youth group. Like we just get in trouble and Pastor Chris yells at us. There's something called church discipline, where when there are issues or problems in the church, somebody deals with it. We want to be loving. We want to be compassionate. We want to be merciful. We want to be kind. We want to be forgiving. And we're striving to be all of those things. But when there is an issue or a problem or a sin, we've got to deal with it. We can't just let it go on. We can't just let it continue. You know why? Why can't we just leave the person alone? Why can't we just leave the person alone? Because what happens is that person begins to affect other people around them. And because we love all of you, because we love the entire group, and we want what's best for you, when problems or issues come up, we have to deal with them. And yeah, it's awkward. It's hard. It's hard having to go to somebody and say, hey, look, you've been doing such and such, or, hey, come on over here, we got to have a conference, or we got to talk, or whatever. It's very, very difficult, but the idea, the goal is always that the offender, the person that's doing the wrong, that they would stop and return their heart to the Lord, and that they would be forgiven and grow. And some of you have experienced that. Some of you have experienced that. Some of you know that I'm not looking to try and kick people out, but that I'm trying to keep as many of you in as we can. And most of the time when people have gotten in, fusion students have gotten in trouble or something, most of the time people, they go, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to stay. I want to stick around. I want to be here. It's been rare that someone has said, well, you know what, forget you guys, you're not going to accept me or whatever, then, forget you, I'm leaving. And that's rare. The majority of the time, people stop what they're doing and they get right with the Lord. And that's the goal. That's what we want. That's what we want, because we love you guys. We want you to be here, and we understand, I understand, all the leaders understand, that there isn't one perfect person in here. This is a hospital. That's what this is. Where people who are struggling, who are sick, who are struggling with sin, they come here. They're imperfect people. That's what this is. This is not like some sterile place where you come to and we've got one of those wands at the front door and, oh, you've got sin in your life, get out of here, go fix that and come back next week. We don't do that. You're struggling, come in. We want to help you. We want to pray for you. We want to give you the word. We want to talk with you. We want to minister to you. Paul, his instructions in this case for this sinful situation, for both sinful situations, was that they separate this individual. Verse 6, he says, we read it already, but he says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Now, Paul uses this illustration from the Old Testament. Some of you will be familiar with this if you've been here on Sundays, because we talked about this in Exodus, about leaven. And look what he says in verse 6. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Does anybody know what leaven is? Anybody? Jordan, what is it?
It's like what makes bread rise.
It's what makes bread rise. Okay, can you give us any more detail, Nathan?
Yeast.
Yeast. Okay, so how do they get leaven? Does anybody know how they get leaven? Where does that even come from? They just go to the store and go to the leaven aisle? Okay, somebody got an answer? Where does leaven come from? She's like, no way, I'm not answering. Okay,
Bacteria.
What do you think? What's that? Wheat fields. Okay, yes, that's at its source. Yes. What'd you say? Okay, but we won't look at her. Okay, so she won't get embarrassed. Bacteria. They take a pinch of that dough and they actually let it ferment. And then what they do is they add that to their loaf of bread, and that's what causes. It's just a pinch, it's just a small amount. But what it does is it causes the bread to rise. Okay? Those of you that bake, some of you bake. You know about, you get a flat cake or you get a nice, fluffy cake, It's what he's talking about here. He says, you know that a little bit of leaven in verse 6 will leaven the whole lump. You see, what he's getting at is this. It may be just one person that's doing this, but that, if we don't stop it, is going to affect the entire group. Just as an example, okay? Throw something wild out there. I'm not saying this has happened or that it's happening, okay? But let's say that somebody in here is doing drugs. And they show up to church and they got drugs, man. And they're telling everybody, I got some drugs, man. Eventually, that is going to get back. Now, you may go, you know what? There's no way I'd never do drugs, and that would be the smartest thing ever, okay? But eventually, the word's going to get back to some parents, right? And then your mom. She cray-cray, right? And she's going to say, there's no way that you are going to that youth group with all them drugs and those wild kids. You're not going back there. And then pretty soon, we'd see people not coming anymore. So when an issue arises, we have to stop it as soon as possible so that doesn't happen. Do you understand what I'm getting at? You understand my example? Okay? So that's what Paul is saying here. He says, man, it's just a little bit of leaven that will leaven. It affects the whole lump. Verse 7, he continues on with that illustration, that thought. Therefore, purge out the old leaven. You got to get rid of that you may be a new lump. Just what you always wanted, to be a lump. Therefore, purge out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. So you can be a new loaf, a new a lump of what did I say? Dough. Verse 7, since you truly are unleavened. He says, you truly are pure. So do not allow this impurity to stay. For indeed, in verse 7, for indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. You see, all of this is pointing back to the book of Exodus when the Passover first started. That's the illustration he's using. But I love here in verse 7. Now, I want you to stop and think about this for just a moment. There's this crazy sexual immorality happening in the church. The church is actually celebrating it. Okay, so the whole thing, man, the whole thing's wrong. And some of us might tend to think, man, we might start asking, are you sure that these people really were saved? I mean, the way they're living, the way they're acting, the way the church is just celebrating it, like, are you sure? Paul reminds them in verse 7, for indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. So he reminds them, look, you're Christians. Yeah, you're blowing it big time, but you're still Christians. And so what he's telling them is you got to live like it, man. You got to get rid of that leaven, get it out of there. Remember that Jesus sacrificed himself for us. Verse 8, therefore let us keep the feast. That's the feast of unleavened bread. Let us keep the feast. Not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. They had something called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And part of that, the feast began with, there was a point where the mom in each family would light her candle. And she would go throughout the house looking for leaven. It was part of the ceremony. It's not like, oh, I don't know, I may have put some leaven in the bathroom cabinet. It's not something like that. It was part of the ceremony. It was symbolic, and she would go around and look, and they would get all the leaven. Part of the ceremony or the feast was to empty the house of leaven. No leaven was allowed. So basically you're eating tortillas, man. They're just flat, no leaven. But the mom would go throughout the house, and she'd open up the cabinets and the cupboards and look in all the corners, and the family would follow along, kids follow along, and okay, we're looking for leaven. There's no, and the idea was they're purging all the leaven, getting it out. And so what Paul is doing is he's using that as an illustration. He's saying, look, you're like a home, and it's like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and you're doing good, you're doing great, except that you've got this leaven in there, and it needs to go because it's affecting everybody. So you got to get it out. So in a sense, he's telling them, okay, get your candle and go through the house and look for the leaven and find it. And when you find it, you got to get rid of it. The separation, get it out. For the health and well-being of the entire body, the entire church. He moves now in verse 9. He's dealt with inside the church. Now from verse 9 down to verse 13, he will talk about what to do when it's outside the church. Outside the church. What do we do about that? When there is sexual immorality outside the church. He says in verse 9, he says, I wrote to you, this is strange, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Wait a minute, what epistle? That means I wrote to you in my letter. Evidently, he had written a letter prior to this that we don't have. What did it say? What was it? What was in there? We don't know, but evidently this is one of the things that he talked about in that letter. He says in verse 9, I wrote to you in my epistle, in my letter, not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Now, some of us are down with that. We're like, yeah, we shouldn't be hanging out with sexually immoral people. We got to be careful here. Verse 10, he says this. Follow Paul. This is heavy. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters. Since then, you would need to go out of the world. So what you're like, wait, what did Paul just say? Paul said, listen, I told you not to hang out with sexually immoral people. We go, yeah, it's the same thing my parents told me, man. Got it. But then Paul goes on in verse 10 to say, however, I'm not talking about the sexually immoral people of this world. Not the Christians, but those that aren't Christian. And you go, wait a minute, do you mean, okay, wait, Paul is telling us to separate ourselves from the sexually immoral people. But he wasn't talking about the unsaved sexually immoral people. So wait, are we supposed to hang out with them? That's what Paul is saying here in verse 10. Now we've got to be careful. We've got to have some balance. Verse 10. Now he's going to go on to explain. But verse 10, he's saying, listen, the people in this world, the ones that aren't saved, they are sexually immoral. They're covetous. They're extortioners, idolaters. They're more than that. He says, but if you're going to avoid those people, you basically have to leave the world because they're all over the place. We're reminded of Jesus, right? Who was accused of being a wine bibber. Wine bibber. He was accused of hanging out with winos. You know what a wino is? You know, a drunkard. He was accused of hanging out with winos and prostitutes and tax collectors, sinful people. And certainly Jesus was absolutely comfortable with those people. There was the time in John chapter 4 when he was at the well and the woman came, and this woman was, she was a sexually immoral woman. And Jesus had no problem being there with her because his motives were pure. Because his goal was to draw that woman to his Father, to God. So that should be our goal also. Let me tell you what Paul's not telling us here in verse 10. Paul's not telling us, hey, listen, go spend all of your time out in the world with sexually immoral people, covetous people, extortioners, idolaters. Go hang out with all of them and spend all of your time. That's not what he's saying. However, what he is saying is we ought not be repelled by those people either. Because what we should be doing is doing what Jesus did and sharing the gospel, sharing God's good news with those people. So we may find ourselves in the company of immoral people. And we don't have to put up a cross and like, yeah, get away from me, you know, don't touch me or don't breathe on me or don't look at me, you know, I'm a Christian, get away. But what we should, our attitude should be, is to share the gospel with those individuals. Now, if they reject it, don't want to hear it, then I make my exit. No need to stay. There's no reason for me to hang out on some street corner in San Bernardino with winos if they're not hearing if they're not receiving the gospel, if they're not receptive to the word of God that I'm trying to share with them. Back when I was 20 years old, I had just gotten saved. And I had been saved for just a couple of weeks. I'm at school. I was at the junior college in town. And a friend of mine, everybody knew that I was a Christian now. They're all trying to like figure it out, what's going on, what's happening, he's not going to parties with us anymore, but he's still kind of hanging out, what's going on. And my friend says, hey, so what is Christianity all about? And I started to share the gospel with them. Started to tell them, and I didn't really know much, but it's like, well, Jesus forgave my sins, and he gave me a new start, and I was trying to share that with him. And my group of friends got angry at me. And they actually turned against me. So I knew that day they were not receptive, so it was not my responsibility nor my desire to stay and hang out with them anymore. From that day, I grabbed my backpack, I walked away, and some of them I have not seen to this day. Some of them I have. But they were not receptive to what I was trying to share with them. Therefore, at that point, then there's no longer any reason for me to stay. And I left at that point. Now, if they're receptive, I want to keep sharing. If they want to know more, I want to keep sharing. And I want to spend time with them. But Paul is saying here, listen, we're not to avoid those people that are out. The people that aren't saved, We're not to avoid them altogether, because then they're never going to hear the word of God. They're never going to hear about the Lord. Verse 11, but now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother. Okay, what he was telling them was, if they're calling themselves a Christian, they're part of the church, but they are, verse 11, look at this list. If they're calling themselves part of the church, but they're sexually immoral, they're covetous or an idolater, a reviler, a drunkard, an extortioner, he says, do not even eat with such a person. Don't even eat with them. Don't spend time with them. That's church discipline, okay? And let me tell you this. It doesn't mean that, listen, if the Christian is involved in some of this stuff, if they're struggling, that's a whole different story. If they're struggling with it, like, man, I need you to pray for me. I'm falling into this sin and I need you to pray for me. It's okay to keep them there and to minister to them and to help them. It's when the Christian, or at least the so-called Christian, is saying, you know what, this is what I'm doing, man, and I don't care who knows about it. I'm just doing it out in the open. Then it's time to say, all right, you got to go. You cannot stay here. It'll leave. If an individual is proud of their sin, or they're boasting about it, they're celebrating it, then it's time for that separation. When the Christian is struggling, we need to not shoot our wounded, because, oh man, they're struggling, so just kick them out, man. We got to love them and help them and assist them. So he's talking here in verses 10 and 11. He makes a distinction. There's people outside of the church. We need to love them, okay? In fact, let's go ahead and get that up on the screen if you can for me. The people outside of the church, we've got to love them. People inside of the church that aren't letting go of their sin, we need to separate. Verse 12, for what have I to do with judging those also who are outside? Paul says, that's not my job. I don't judge people on the outside. The people that aren't in the church, it's not my job. Do you not judge those who are inside? Our job is to work with those that are inside the church. You know the world, people that aren't Christians, you know that the world is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing? The question is the church doing exactly what it is supposed to be doing? The world is supposed to be getting worse. They're supposed to be involved in all of these sins. We get so angry, man, and we want to picket and walk with flags and say, we hate you people. But they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. What about you and I? Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Finally, we finish in verse 13. We want to love them, love the people that are outside the church involved in sin. We need to love them, and we need to, in verse 13, let God judge them, not us. But those who are outside, God judges. Therefore, because of all these things, he tells us again, gives us instructions, put away from yourselves the evil person. In other words, God will judge the people outside the church. Our job is to separate from the people that are inside the church that are not letting go of their sin, that are holding on to it, that are celebrating proud of it. Why? Motivated by love. Motivated by love. Because we want that person to turn. We want them to understand the seriousness of it and turn. Father, help us, please.